All right, we're going to go ahead and start back up for our next discussion. I'd like to introduce Nancy Mendonca from NASA. She's Deputy of Aeronautics Research Mission Directorate, Mission Integration Office. And she will be talking about community acceptance of VTOL and how we should approach this issue. Nancy, please come up. And a few other things. Thank you.
So welcome. Thanks for joining us. I appreciate folks to coming in person. I know it's a challenge these days. You can say, do I get on an airplane or do I sit in front of the screen on my teleconferencing software of choice? So I do appreciate that. So a little bit of background. I went to the Naval Academy, did 20 years in the Navy. Flew H-46s, so definitely have my heart in the helicopter community. I do love that tandem rotor airframe. But for the safety note, I did one engine fire, one hydraulic failure, and if you know anything about how the Navy deploys its H-46s, we go out in pairs of helicopters on the resupply ships. So there's typically 2 helicopters per ship. And we were transiting down to Australia. My playmate had a problem on the flight deck, and we are in the middle of the Pacific, and my fuel's going low. So thankfully, the Navy had another ship that was close enough. We were able to go refuel. But so that's my experience and safety on those things. After retired from the Navy, I did 4 years in a contractor. I did a little bit with the Missile Defense Agency, with the Marine Corps, working on the MRAPs and the counter IEDs, and then worked with NTIA on the National Spectrum Plan. So kind of a broad knowledge, not very deep in areas, but enough to know most of the lingo and the acronyms, or where to go find some of those things. So, and then in 2009, came to NASA. I started off in the airspace program. And then I moved on to doing portfolio management for ARMD's research portfolio. So I have got a pretty good knowledge of most of the areas of research that ARMD is doing. And then 4 years ago, NASA stood up we called it the UCAT, the UAM Coordination Assessment Team. And I was a NASA POC for the 2 urban air mobility market studies. So I'm thinking those are probably widely recognized across the community in there. So been doing urban air mobility and now advanced air mobility for about 4 years now. Takeaways today. Want to both understand where your questions are and kind of have an interactive. Please ask questions. Like to learn. I also like to learn from you. A lot of the work that I have done has been compilations pulling from the SMEs in the community and expertise. So I make some observations, some opinions, some thoughts, but definitely like to hear feedback and learn from what you all have to say. I thought about starting this earlier and I didn't, or figuring out how to work these things. It gets me. So a little bit of overview at NASA, just because I'm a hierarchical thinker. NASA now has 5 mission directorates. Aeronautics Research Mission Directorate is one of the smallest. Our budget's around 19 billion. Aeronautics is under $1 billion itself. So that's kind of gives you a perspective of where we fit. There are 4 programs within the Aeronautics Research Mission Directorate, and across those 4 programs, we have 14 or 16 projects. 16 projects. So the projects are organized by domain. So vehicle, airspace, transformative research, and then integrated higher TRL research. But we've seen some utility in starting to cross the silos. So that's what this slide is. And you kind of see some of our ultra efficient aircraft research, our future airspace research, our supersonics, and then our urban air mobility. And then that also led into the creation of the mission offices. Now we now have 3 mission offices that are able to do coordination across our projects that are in different programs, but also up and out across the community. So the first one that stood up was our supersonics mission office. So they coordinated with the CST program that's in the CST project, which is in the vehicle program, the flight demonstration project, which is within the integrators, and now the building of the supersonic airplane, which is also in the integration program. So we found the utility in being able to do some cross coordination. But to kind of get down into the noise and public perception, we don't have the experience that at NASA that the FAA does in engaging the community, but we've done several efforts and we've learned some things. So our supersonics folks did an effort down in Galveston in 2018, looking at supersonic booms and how to gauge public perception of the noise from the boom. Our UAS and the NAS project did the TCLs, if you're familiar with, and the TCL, it wrapped up with the TCL4s in Reno, Nevada and Corpus Christi, Texas. So part of those efforts were actually surveying the public as the drones flew over and understanding how to get that public input and things along those lines. We've started 5 agreements with local communities and departments of transportation right now. So we call them Space Act agreements. It's kind of it's a NASA type of agreement that we have. But the agreements are currently with the Ohio Department of Transportation, the Massachusetts Department of Transportation, North Central Texas Council of Governments, the City of Orlando, and then the Minnesota Department of Transportation. So we have those. And then in the future, our Revolutionary Vertical Lift project will be doing some noise work and assessing public perception around noise. So we've got that coming up. AAM. I'll start with the definition. Down at the bottom, there are 4 definitions that I've seen, and I'm sure we'll come up with quite a few more. Robert had one that he presented earlier. We've liked this one. It's a little more aspirational and not so much of the regulatory perspective that Robert has to deal with, but the sustainable, affordable, and accessible aspects of eVTOL are what we're trying to shape AAM to be. Congress has a different definition in its bills. SAE has a standard for taxonomy that has a different definition. So some challenges. I think to me, the most illuminating part has been to have the conversation of differing opinions and why this is in and why this isn't out, or this is out. So, but to talk to the taxonomy part, we've also been challenged by use of use cases, missions, scenarios, and things along those lines. So we're working with our friends at the FAA to kind of organize that so that when we talk use case, we both mean the same thing, and when we talk scenario, we both mean the same thing. But so on this slide, we have got 3 what we're calling reference missions. That's the urban air mobility, the regional air mobility, and a new term that we're tossing out there for people to comment on, low altitude mobility, so LAM. So LAM, RAM, and then UAM. It's a little different than UTM, and it may, LAM it may get accepted, it may not, but UTM typically was focused on the traffic management. So we wanted a term that was also inclusive of the vehicles. So that's why we've proposed it, but like to hear people's opinions and thoughts and better ideas than we have out there. So like I said, so those are the 3 reference missions that we have out or on here. The 4th one is an application, and that's the public good one. So we're also looking at that. Robert in his slides called it public service. So we might, have the conversation of what do people think of when they mean public good and those kind of things. So we're doing an effort there, but so definitely evolving to taxonomy. I think Rex has talked about taxonomy at the local level quite a bit. And I've got the second slide here, I'll get back into it, but definitely a challenging both from the public perception side is that people have different ideas. You say it and everybody has a little bit different idea. So basically understanding where people think and where they're coming from. This is a slide we've used successfully for quite a while to illustrate AAM as itself. A lot going on in the slide, both our definition again, but this one also has a time phase component to it in the colors. So the AML is AAM maturity level. It's kind of I guess matured from starting calling it UAM initially. But as you work your way through the maturity levels from 1, 2, 3, and 4, you'll get increasing levels of complexity, increasing levels of density, increasing levels of automation. And this is kind of one vision is going forward, but it's helped us to start to have conversations and do the research around it, understand the challenges and the gaps and the stakeholders there. Actually, an interesting story, when we started this effort, we have 6 UML levels, but when we started to define them, we were like 5 and 6 were really a heavy lift, so we kind of backed off and focused on 4. Hopefully in the future, we can get back up to start talking about 5 and 6. And we've got another effort coming along right now to put a Word document to go with this so that we can hand it out to people and people can comment back and hopefully have a better understanding of what we mean by the different AML missions. And we found that's been a successful path in dealing with folks, is to give them multiple avenues of ways to look at things. So whether it's the recording, whether it's the news articles, whether it's the document, and asking for their feedback so we can understand and learn and evolve. This is what our RVLT project has used or is using, is the reference vehicles to do their research. And Mike will give you the slides. Okay. But we've used them, and we published the results. They're publicly available, and they have been beneficial to have conversations around it and talk and for standards and to understand the different complexities in a public forum and be able to use for both the students and NASA and other researchers to use. So they've been, like I said, I think they've been very beneficial to the community. And as Mike's note, the VFS is tracking over 7, I forget the number, is it 720, 730? Yeah, it's a surprisingly sizable number. So, and this is part of the community. You say eVTOL, and they probably have a picture in their mind, and it's maybe not the same picture that you have. So understanding that, I did a conversation around drones, or it was actually around weather. And they said, hey, we'll talk about drones and weather. And I said, tell me what you think a drone is, because to me, I think it's a small UAS, under 55 pounds, below 400 feet. But you could be thinking of, the high altitude long endurance at 60,000 feet, or you could be thinking of something underwater. I said, so having that conversation around the terms and having an understanding where people are at. So as part of our Space Act agreements and actually getting to talk with the communities and interact with them, we kind of saw 3 initial challenges. Awareness. They aren't really aware of what AAM is. They've dealt with ground transportation most of their lives, and the airports have been kind of siloed, so they're not really aware of the terminology, the stakeholders, the roles and responsibilities are continuing to be an interesting conversation. And so then kind of once they're aware of the AAM, and I'll do that. So on part of the awareness one is we're working and got asked about where people would like to see vertiports. And, kind of the other question was, are people thinking public or private? We didn't do really well on the public or private question, because we hit the roadblock on what's AAM and what's a vertiport question. So the company that actually did it, they did 1,500 interviews. It was a 20-minute survey, so fairly extensive, racked and stacked demographics, 12 different ways. But we focused on Ohio because we had the partnership there, and then also Los Angeles because they look like they're going to be an early adopter. So 750 respondents in Ohio and 750 in Los Angeles. But about 75% of the people who started the survey didn't know what AAM was. So the survey was actually constructed to give them increasing levels of information as they went through. But you can imagine it's really hard to engage the public and have a conversation when you're also trying to teach them what it is. So that was an interesting challenge. Some other interesting notes from the survey, and they did present. It is presented, and the recording is available. But back to the question of where would people like vertiports? Most of the respondents replied that they would like a vertiport within 20 miles of their home. But they would, but more than 10 miles away. And it's kind of okay. But in that, people were either pretty pro vertiports or they were pretty against vertiports. So there was not a lot of middle ground of like, yeah, maybe, I don't know. It was kind of like, no way. And yeah, that'd be awesome. So kind of a different, interesting perspective. Surveys are challenging. I think you'll see there's a couple others out there. I encourage folks, if you do look at them, to kind of look down in the notes and look at who they talked to. Did they have a certain demographic they targeted? And surveys are an art. I learned in doing this effort. There's a whole thing around, understanding bias and how you word the questions and how you educate people and things like that. So if you do reference them or look at them, I encourage you to, kind of take that perspective of, okay, what did this survey said? Did it have an ulterior motive? Or whichever. Ours isn't perfect, but it's, I think it's a viable start and valuable for the community. And then I think the other thing we saw was, like we see in transport class, people are just aren't going to fly. And so 20% of the respondents said they would never, ever get an eVTOL. So I think that's an interesting aspect. And you kind of, you see what you watch as you go through the questions and evolve and learn. So kind of getting a little bit back to the taxonomy and the understanding of terms. This has been a real challenge for the local decision makers, is to understand, all the terms, and then we change them on them. So if you follow for air traffic management, everybody's kind of used to ATM, and then we introduced UTM, and now NASA is talking about a concept called XTM, or extensible traffic management for the future. And then, and people have run across USSs for dealing with smalls. And in the ConOps, we introduced the concept called PSUs. And now we're kind of like, is PSU a great term? So yeah, it's challenging, it's frustrating. But like I said, we like the LAM concept. We put it out there and hey, let's see what people rally around, what's useful, what people don't find useful. But as we do this, like I said, I think people learn more in having the conversation around the differences. What do you think AAM is? Why isn't this in AAM, or why is this in AAM? I think those have been the more enlightening conversations. And I think, and then as we come out, we're also going to, from our side, we're going to have to start learning about ground transportation terminology. So, we want a multimodal integrated transportation system. So I think it's on the aviation communities to start to learn about ground transportation and their different concerns and taxonomies. And those along. So, a great example from their side is, highway, freeway, tollway, throughway. So there's very specific meanings for them, but I'm not familiar with all the different nuances in that. So I think being understanding of, how we come from and where they come from is beneficial to work with them. So like I mentioned the Space Act agreements with the 5 partners. These have been great. Understanding of what the challenges are and where we can contribute. One of the questions I frequently get asked from cities is how do I start and who should be on the team? So we pulled together a list, and this is kind of based on the partnerships. So when the communities proposed to our Space Act agreement, we asked them to bring in partners. And surprising, I was surprised. They came in with on the 15 to 20 range of the partners. We expected, we had hoped for to get the OEMs as part of the partnerships. And we did, and some of them were able to. We hoped to get the universities in, and we did. We were very successful. The communities brought in their universities and are developing close partnerships with them. But what I was kind of surprised is they're really focused on the workforce. So a lot of them is like Ohio brought in Jobs Ohio. So we're starting to see that aspect and starting to bring it in. So if you're dealing with the local decision makers, We put out one list here, and then we have another list up on our AEWGs of stakeholders you might consider when if you're going to start a partnership to start thinking about AAM. I think one of the other interesting things we learned is the ground transportation folks have a robust community outreach structure through US DOT and Code 40 and Title 49. So I think it's a great way that we can learn about how they do it and understand it so that we can leverage it. So we don't have to create the wheel when there's public outreach or town halls around vertiports. So like I said, that's that kind of that conversation with the ground folks. What resources do they have? What processes do they use? What can we leverage and what can we team up with them to do? One of my other favorite ones, the AEWGs, right? How many folks are not aware of the AEWGs? No, everybody's seen them. Awesome. So I could skip to the meat of the point. A couple of things here of interest. We're coming up on our 100th meeting. Over 2,000 people are registered to attend. I think there was a question earlier on carports, parking garages. If the Orlando folks are able to make it Thursday, I have my fingers crossed that they will be able to. They actually did a study on the Geico garage for converting it to a vertiport. So Thursday, they're going to present the results from their Geico garage study. Utah is also going to present, their legislature authorized a study on AAM infrastructure. So Utah is going to present the results there. And Ohio has recently published its AAM framework, and Ohio will present an overview to that. For folks interested in noise, there has been a long-standing noise group. They are having a 3-day workshop coming up. The first 2 days are focused on commercial transport noise, but the third day is on UAM noise. So you can register, and if you're interested in noise and down into the weeds technical, that's a great forum. They typically meet quarterly. Great resource. All recorded, the slides are there, and we have everything from 2 sessions on 101 of the NAS.
Sorry, John Daniels, Practice Aerospace. In any of these studies, when you talk about noise or you talk about community outreach, did any of them talk about drones as part of it? And the reason I say is that most people think of drones as those small, 155-pound small UAS. Bring in your truck and drive around and just toss and go, and everything is kind of ephemeral. There are some entities that are trying to do high density, 10, 50, 100 operations an hour out of a single location that aren't currently tracked as vertiports or airport facilities and aren't charted and don't have contact with radar or don't have contact with radios with their users, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm just wondering if any of these is getting looked at, because the difference between a little tiny drone by itself and it with 50 of its friends is something that's relatively spectacular. And for those of us in the traditional world, when we go talk to airport advisory boards and communities and town halls, they get really upset about the drone stuff and then blame us. And that's just one of those things that I really hope we can fix in the future.
Yeah, the closest I've seen, and I haven't seen the results, was some of the surveys that were done in Reno as part of TCL 4. I don't know if the FAA has something from the IPP and the UPP and beyond on public inputs and perceptions from that. And then the other data that we haven't really chased down is whether we're seeing stuff from Alphabet and some of the other they're currently operating. And other than the occasional news article, I think the one in California has been cited pretty frequently about the small transports out there. So let's see. Oh, and like I said, a great one on vertiport automation. So thank you. If you guys go back and watch the recording for that one too. What we leveraged for one of the CIWG meetings, which the Community Integration Working Group, was to kind of collate and collect the knowledge base from the SMEs and the experts out there. When I kind of started into that, my challenge was to come up with 45 things to think about when citing a vertiport. I got a little stretch goalish and said, hey, let's come up with 75. But we got the folks together over the one CIWG and then 2 sidebars and then some more work that we did 2 weeks ago in Dayton. We're over 450 things for a local community to think about when siting a vertiport. So definitely more work to do in this area, but I think it's been a great resource for the community to at least start to have the conversation and start to be able to look at the list. Hopefully we'll be able to start to do this in other areas where the community would find value. I've taken a stab at one with equity. I think that one's going to be a real challenge. It's not my area of expertise, so I'm looking forward to learning as I do it. But definitely, like I said, as part of the AEWGs, definitely interested in understanding where people find challenges and what information they would find valuable, so that we can incorporate that into the presentations and bringing folks together to have conversations and move from beyond admiring the problem to actually doing something and putting out information like this that people can leverage and utilize. The communities are also doing work and publishing things, documents for people to use. I think most of you are familiar with state aviation plans and the public comment processes they go through, but we're also seeing, I mentioned Ohio's reference framework that they've published and put online. The second image there is Minnesota DOT did an AAM strategy document. The third one in the corner there is Ohio did an economic analysis, and they have published that online. That's kind of one of the great things about working with the local state decision makers is they do a study and they publish it. So it's available for both the the community and other states and localities to use. I think the challenge is being aware that it's out there. And Orlando has stood up a website for their AAM plan, and there's currently a survey. I don't know if it's still active or not, but they were doing a survey of where the local public would like to see vertiports in Orlando. So, and I expect we'll see more of these as they start to come out, and as states get a little bit more bandwidth and have a little more interest in it. Another area that we're kind of working with and understanding the challenges has been NASA's SBIR program. These are almost all of the AAM related SBIRs from the last 2 years. This represents about $14 million in research. Of interest are the first two up there. I think, yes. So we heard from the communities that they didn't really have the resources to go out to the state fairs and the town halls and the public forums to present to people. The specific instance was one of the MPOs in Ohio. She goes to state fairs. So she says, I don't have flyers to take to state fairs. So I said, all right, hey, there's not an industry out there to be able to meet this need for the local communities. So how do we see if we can use the SBIR program to kickstart an effort or, companies that can actually go into a locality, understand where they're coming from, what their culture is, what their needs are, and be able to parse all of this AAM information into both something that they've got the bandwidth for, that speaks to their local needs and their local desires, and how do they use that information to educate both their decision makers and then turn around and use that to educate the public. So that's been great. On the theme from VAST and one, the helicopter side, I think the SBIRs in green would be of interest. AAM, obviously, weather observations like the helicopter community has been dealing with are fairly sparse at the planetary boundary layer level. So we've kicked off 3 nested SBIRs to start to look at how do we improve weather observations at the lower altitudes to benefit both GA aircraft, helicopters, and the eVTOLs. The FAA folks have been very much on board, and it's partnering with their effort to qualify weather supplemental data service providers that's currently in their national segment invitation plan. ASTM is working on a weather performance standard, and then which will be, as Robert mentioned, going to performance-based. So, this ASTM standard will start to look at the performance-based. And then by building this test bed down there, we hope to have a place that we can validate that standard and then use it for other purposes and testing. The second one of the 3 I found really interesting was its basic premise is to look to see how an algorithm can tell if a sensor is giving accurate data. So, as a tree branch landed on the anemometer, you don't want to have to send a person out all the time. So it's looking at how to do that. So, but I'm kind of on the other one is, or I guess takeaway from this is always interested to hear challenges. I know, the springtime is my time that I start to write my subtopics. So always interested to have a conversation with people, what they think the big challenges are coming up. I think the community education one has evolved that way, but also there are great resources out there for both the small communities and understanding. So, takeaways, couple other notes. We've got, like I said, I think everybody is very agreeing that safety is very important, and we're definitely hearing that from the communities. We're also hearing that they're very concerned about equity and diversity. So I think that's going to be a challenge, because I know from my perspective, I'm not very conversant in, work on equity and diversity. I understand the basic concepts, but I'm not, I'm not a master's student writing papers on it. So I don't know how we could say, hey, we can make AAM equitable. I think that'll be a different challenge that we'll have to learn and address. Our safety folks in the system-wide safety project have expanded their system to take safety reports on the UASs now. So that's been a valuable tool for the community and the research, and I expect that they'll continue to mature and evolve. And then always, like I say, we're dealing with the STEM, or doing STEM efforts out there in combinations for around AAM, engagement with the community, understanding where people are, what the needs are, and then hopefully that next generation of workforce is where we're trying to go. So questions, I think
Any questions for Ms. Mendoza?
I think one of our challenges going forward, I think if, once we get over the understanding, awareness, and informational issue is what's going to be the next challenge. So kind of interested to hear what people think around that. Some thoughts I've heard in different quarters is designing AAM as a system, which is much more challenging than locating a few vertiports, but the people have drawn the parallels with the metro system. You don't just go out and build 3 metro stations, you design a metro system and then incrementally build to it. So are there lessons learned we could, is that going to be one of our future challenges, to start to understand how do we do this at a system level, so that when, 40 years down the road, we have a system that we want and not one that we feel has been pieced together. So, but like I said, you guys are the SMEs, and I'm really interested in saying, picking your brains, what do you think the current challenges are and then the future challenges are?
I do have one question online. In planning for the different use cases, is NASA looking at personal use of AAM, which is privately owned and operated? Is it included in local passenger transport, or does local passenger transport refer to air taxi and commercial operations only?
So we use the use cases to understand the technical challenges. So that's been our purpose for articulating the use cases. So and why we started at UAM, which people are now saying, hey, it may not be the most sustainable use case. And so we're stepping back and taking a look at that. But we use them, like I say, to identify the technical challenges. And so maybe the on-demand, or the personal, I forget Mark's term for it off the top of my head, but are there technical challenges in that use case that we've not already captured in other use cases? So maybe there are, maybe there aren't. I think we'll look at them. But as a federal agency, I can say right now that we're very interested in the public good, the public service use cases, both understanding how we, the nuances around the edges and what are those going to be. And like I say, kind of details. If I think folks might be aware from the Booz Allen market study that one of the use cases we looked at was the medical transport. And we were really surprised that they came out and said that it wasn't really a great business model for the eVTOL. And when we dug it, and that was, and thinking back, so it's 2018, so we know a lot more now. But then it came down to that the helicopters could launch much more rapidly and didn't have the downtime with charging. And so that aspect of, and that, you know, combined with the assumptions they made looking at that use case was, hey, you know, medical is probably not going to be a great use case for the eVTOLs. So it's those kind of understandings. So now can we, you know, maybe we'll go back and look at that use case again. We know more. Let's relook at our assumptions. Are our assumptions still valid? And understand, you know, what are we thinking about that public good or public service use case? I think there was a second part to the question.
It was primarily on the personal
On the
use.
personal.
Yeah.
Thank you. On the survey that you did, could you refresh? People indicated that they wanted access to a vertiport and they wanted it within 20 miles, right?
Yeah, 20 minutes.
20 minutes. Okay. So I'm wondering if there's not like kind of a NIMBY situation here. You know, I want access to it, but I don't want all the things, the downside, the externalities that go with it. Is that coming out?
Yeah, I think that was part of it. It was that I think the mental trade that it's really surveys have a tough time dealing with is what do and we see it in demand surveys when you look at multimodal demand studies is how does a person decide whether they're going to drive, walk, bike, metro, train, bus, whichever. So basically, you know, understand those. But I think it's part of it was I think education. It was in a 20-minute survey. It was kind of hard to bring somebody from zero to, you know, a good understanding enough to have a more than a solid or, you know, more than a guess of opinion. So, but like I said, I think you know, the federal government has a love-hate relationship with surveys.
Right.
They're really hard for us to do.
Well, they're also,
yeah.
you know, it's really hard to square the corner and get meaningful data, but it's interesting to see, you know, how people want them as sort of a community resource, but sounds like there might be a limit as to how much of a community.
Yeah. One other interesting thing that, and Rex and I saw it at one of the presentations a couple weeks ago, was people said they're willing to do a trade from something that's an eyesore to something that's like a vertiport that potentially wouldn't be. So, you know, an abandoned gas station or, you know, a fenced off, you know, weed yard, they were much more amenable to say, hey, you know, maybe that's a good spot for vertiport because I would much rather look at a vertiport building than this, you know, this junk pile that I've been looking at for however. So yeah, some interesting conversations. You know, we kind of guessed that people wouldn't want vertiports next to parks. But the survey also said that they weren't really interested next to sporting events. So, you know, is it kind of okay? Now let's dig in and understand in some of those. So definitely. And I think we'll see, you know, we've seen in aircraft design and performance, you know, Chicago's different than Phoenix, is different than LA. And so I think that's one of the interesting things about AAM. I think it's very tailorable. So I think it's going to be a challenge to understand where the community's goals are and how AAM can fit in with their infrastructure and their goals. Do they have transportation deserts? Do they have food deserts? Are they, you know, they battling past inequity issues of a freeway going through a neighborhood? So how can we, you know, frame the AAM conversation to meet those, overcome those challenges and better meet the community's needs? I think it's like I say, it's so flexible because we have the ability to not be tied to, you know, contiguous infrastructure other than, you know, the electrical.
Other questions? We got one online? All right. Well, I'm walking over there. I have a question for you. So in the space of working between federal aviation and local municipalities, what is NASA finding in disparity in taxonomy, terminology, and different languages? Because we talk airspace versus land use.
I think mostly it's anecdotal in talking to the aviation divisions within the transportation departments of transportation that actually have aviation divisions. And they're very used to not talking to their ground transportation folks. And they are actually now starting to get together and have conversations. So I think that's been very interesting. I haven't gotten any comments on what they're learning and where the taxonomy is breaking down from them, but we are getting ready to sign a subsequent annex with 4 of the 5 companies, or 4 of the 5 DOTs. And we're gonna start to, the first kickoff is to bring in their ground transportation planners so that we can understand how they do things and what their processes are, so that as we start to look at public good use cases, we can make sure that those use cases can be used by the communities with their ground transportation folks to have that more integrated conversation.
So this question is a little bit of a different tactic and a little bit of a different direction, but the propellers operate at a much higher speed than those of rotorcraft. Have you taken into account loss of a blade that could hit the cabin where the passengers and crews are sitting in the middle of?
In my office, no. And I think it's I would defer the question to our RBLT folks on, and their reference at vehicles. And it's part of the conversation. I know that we've been very interested in crash worthiness. But so far we're starting to, pull together and look at different efforts of what we can do around crash worthiness for eVTOLs. But I think Robert has mentioned, we're really challenged with all of the different configurations and understanding, how do we do something that is performance-based, that's valuable and provides, the proper guidance. It's performance-based challenges or performance-based standards are challenging. If folks have ever done the mental exercise of how do I write a performance-based, one performance-based standard, we're very used to, don't fly in 60 knots of wind, and people can resonate with that. But, you can say, don't fly in something that's going to exceed your control authority. That's really, it's a little something different to wrap your brain around. So I think it's, and then you go to the local communities, explain performance-based standard, and they're like, whoa, wait a minute. Just tell me, if it's 60 knots, they're not flying.
I think that question falls more in the FAA realm in terms of certification. And we certainly do have a lot of regulations. I don't know them off the top of my head, but please be assured that when we certify an aircraft, or we don't care what it's called, okay? But all these considerations and much, much more is considered, and when we say that it has a type certification. So, thank you.
And I think there's, like I said, there's interesting things to note from other anecdotes in other areas as we talk about vehicle design and public perception. I mean, if you look back to the car industry, I've heard them talk about, they do efforts to make sure that when the door closes, it's a solid thunk. It's not a tinny closing sound. So I think we'll see the same thing with people in eVTOLs. They walk up to a vehicle on the pad and they're like, I just don't feel comfortable with it. And it's not, probably not anything that you can quantify. It's like, the blades are too low, or I could see the blades, or things like that. It's going to be kind of understanding. So which brings me back to the public perception versus public acceptance conversation. NASA did start out with a barrier on public acceptance. But as we started talking with our FAA colleagues and the folks in the supersonics who have dealt with noise far longer than I have, they came back and said, please don't call it public acceptance. We can't regulate, quantify, or measure how people, if they accept it or not. And it's and then you kind of have the question of, is it our job to have people accept it? Or is our job to provide people information and they make their own decision? So I very early in this career of talking with the FAA got waved off the term of public acceptance. So now I try and use public perception. I'm not perfect. I do lapse, but like I say, it's kind of back to the taxonomy question. It's really interesting. You start to have the conversations with the supersonic folks who have lived it, And they're like, we've been down that road. You don't want that T-shirt. And how to adopt those learnings and conversations and pass them on.
Okay.
Sorry, and again, John Daniels. You mentioned UTM and you talked about PSUs and you talked about the automation. One of the big differences in eVTOL compared to what we've been used to is the idea that it's no longer just concrete slabs. They're now talking to each other and there's an infrastructure tying it together for telecommunications. Have you done any outreach on that, or can you talk a little bit more about the expansion of UTM from Joey Rios and PK's little project into the monstrosity it is now? Sorry, large construct that is now, and how that's expanded to integrate, and whether it has integrated the legacy users and that type of thing.
In detail, probably not, but we do recognize that there's an issue and some conversations. I don't know if folks are aware the DODIG just published a report on UTM and had some interesting findings. So understanding those and having the conversation. I think, let's see. Oh, when I was talking about the mission slide, I mentioned we're doing an effort. So part of that is to go back in some of our work on UAM, where we've done our goal chart. I'm thinking most folks have seen our goal chart. But we're going to, under this effort, we're going to do a goal chart for both LAM and RAM, so we can understand and take the FAA's inputs and their thoughts and what the community's thinking is, what are those goals for both RAM and LAM, and understand, where are the challenges, and like we use for use cases, where are they similar, where are they different, and where can we focus our efforts to get the most bang for our research dollars. But yeah, Joey, they had the kickoff meeting yesterday. Joey Rios is there, so we're definitely going to leverage a lot of their expertise. And then it's typical with a lot of the studies, and like Roberts, we start off with the literature search. Our typical one in this field has been to start off with the interviews. So I would like to thank all of you who have participated in our interviews, for our patience, and for us coming back to our SMEs multiple times. So we greatly appreciate that. And also, if you would like to weigh in on the subject, definitely let us know. We'll sign you up for interviews. But in both of the efforts I mentioned, the public good effort and then the RAM-LAM effort, we're planning midterm and final briefs on the AEWG site, so people can stay informed and have an opportunity to see what we're thinking and provide comments.
Any other questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
Thank you. This question is a bit more business oriented, so it might be over your field a little bit. But given that eVTOL has been modeled along the Uber Black in terms of being affordable and costs in terms of operations per mile for the aircraft, one thing I haven't seen much information on is what are the landing fees going to be charged for vertiports? When you consider the fact that commercial real estate agents are now looking at prime locations in cities, plus the cost of the vertiport, plus the cost of the charging, helicopters right now get charged a pretty good chunk of change for landing at a heliport. Is there any information on, factoring in the landing fees, the city taxes, the state taxes? And is it really seriously to be considered that this is going to be affordable transportation for the masses based on that?
Nothing that I've seen publicly. I think if I would expect several of the companies have probably done it as part of it. Another, similar effort that we've been looking at is talking about sustainability and how do you compare an AAM mission versus an automated vehicle. I think one of our failings has been we're watching aviation advance so rapidly, but we're also not attributing the same rate of advancement in other forms of transportation. So I think we're like, hey, everybody's going to take RAM and do it, but if you're looking at 15 years, 30, 20 years from now, and you have an automated car, it's going to be that mode choice question again. Do you load up the family and all the baggage in the automated car? Or do you get on the RAM aircraft? I think they have to have that conversation, and it's a challenging question, a challenging conversation. But I think we've seen, I've heard that the UPS and FedEx and those folks have done it from the cargo perspective, probably with a lot better data and a lot more refined search. So yeah, they probably won't make the results public, but it'd be interesting to understand their methodology and their processes to see how we can leverage it to start to have those kind of conversations. Yeah, definitely some challenging areas. Like I say, public perception is very challenging, equity is very challenging, affordability is challenging. I had a couple of interns to last summer that looked at fuel taxation, because that's been another big question that's come up. How, if we go all electric vehicles, what, airports rely on fuel taxes for their revenues and in different funds, what's it going to look like? And we came up with it's almost different in every state how they tax them. So it was impossible for the couple of interns to really start to wrap their brain around what the state of the art is today, to understand the percentage, how big is the problem? Is it 5 states really rely on fuel taxes and the rest, yeah, it's kind of in the weeds or in the margins, but it's not, like I say, it's probably a doctoral thesis to really understand it, and and a ton of interviews to be able to say, hey, this city has this tax, this state does this tax, or this state taxes after 10,000 gallons. We have a lot of work to do.
Other questions? I got one online as I'm walking. So I'm going to pile on what Jonathan Daniel said earlier, in that when we look at doing passenger transport versus cargo transport, we look at the SUAS, the small unmanned aerial systems, is NASA looking at anything in that space in regard to infrastructure and working with the FAA? What do we call them? Are we going to call those drone ports if they're 55 pounds and under? And when you have a volume of 50,000 plus a year, are we going to plot them on a map like we would an alert area on a sectional for notification to general aviation?
Yeah. So not in general. We do have a sub-project, the high density vertiplex sub-project, which is using smalls to start to understand the challenges around the automated vertiport. But that is, it's kind of been one area that we haven't really looked at. I think there'll be some interesting parallels between smalls, in interactions with vertiport spaces, and what are there parallels we can draw with eVTOLs in the airport space? What are the similarities and what are the differences? How to have that conversation and understand those complexities.
So I have 2 questions. First question, you mentioned that communities addressed issues such as noise, safety, etc. Has anyone ever brought up the issue of eroded downwash in communities where eVTOLs are proposed to operate at low altitudes?
We do have it on a considerations list, but I think one of my best was an anecdote we heard early on when we were writing the ConOps. Was a person in LA was an event planner, and they did weddings on rooftops, and they were concerned about of having a pad on the neighboring building that would blow all their tents off of the rooftop for their event. So yeah, I think, like I said, I think that was part of the impetus behind the considerations document, was to start to capture a lot of those things and thinking, so that people could say, hey, yeah, that probably doesn't apply, or I didn't think about that. I need to, to dig in and look at it, hit it there. But yeah, and as Robert mentioned, it's going to be definitely a challenging area to understand the physics from these vehicles.
Second question, a little longer, but also to piggyback on the earlier question of NIMBYs, not in my backyard group. Did surveys address whether the respondents were coming from dense urban centers, suburbs, rural areas, etc.? As an example, I would characterize the community where I live as a bedroom community / suburb that is on the edge of a suburban sprawl of a major city. Because of that, I suspect that there would be very different opinions on eVTOL within my community.
Yes, it did. The survey actually coded people by their zip code. And I think it had on the order of like 15 other demographic questions between, obviously the age, gender, income, marital status, family. I think they even asked political persuasion as part of it. But I would recommend, like say, Wyatt presented at one of the CIWGs, so I would recommend going back and digging into some of his details. He's got quite a few of the graphs and the data in there. And then we also do have the question bank for folks that kind of want to leverage it. I think he has that towards the end of his slides.
Any other questions from the audience or online? I will definitely make a plug for the NASA Ecosystem Series. If you haven't participated, I highly recommend it because it's one of the best places to go to have conversations about VTOL, eVTOL, advanced air mobility with like-minded individuals. It's a fantastic free flow of information. The brainstorming sessions I've been involved in are just phenomenal. So highly recommend them. If you haven't done one, there are four groups. Four groups.
And I did, Ted presented 2 weeks ago, and I leveraged Ted's going to present for us in November. So he was with Fleming Garnett for the Uber studies. So he's going to represent the work that he did. If folks haven't already looked at that. And then in December, the GAO is going to come present on the 2 a.m. reports that they have. And then I think they're on the hook to do a third one in the Coordination and Leadership Act. So, but it'd be, if folks are interested in, GAO methodology or findings or something, we'll have that up in December.
And all the ones that have been done up to this point have been recorded or are online on the website. So I would say that if you haven't seen any of those, some of them are very, very good. So I point you that direction.
Yeah, for the folks that are really technical, I think I haven't gotten a chance to watch it, but we're starting there was a V2V one and starting to have a V2V series, which is going to be really interesting, both from a technical and a safety aspect. And the other one I've been fascinated with is our airspace program is doing their research plan and research and all the activities. And I think they're having another one coming up to talk about the comments they've gotten on their research plan. So definitely some interesting ones there.
Okay. Well, Nancy, thank you so much for your time and greatly appreciate the information. So you'll get done a little early, so you have a little longer lunch break to have lunch and network. Any questions at this point that anyone has on anything that's been discussed so far? We can get you an answer to it. Don't hesitate to come up to me and ask me.
The last word in the citing of is that likely to be local community plan commissions and related entities that sort of final.
Mm-hmm. So the question is who has the last word in citing a vertiport? So when you look at doing the vertiport, there are 3 levels, 3 layers that you have to deal with. You have the federal level. The federal level provides the standard. So that today for heliports would be the Heliport Design Advisory Circular. For us now, it's in vertiports is the engineering brief. So the FAA, you file the paperwork, they do the airspace determination. That's looking primarily at the airspace. The FAA does not look at land use. The next level would be the state. So each state is basically given the opportunity to regulate to their desire how they interpret, implement, and what oversight they provide today for heliports. So a heliport in Illinois has to have a license. It has to meet the advisory circular for heliports. And you have to go through that process, and they have additional criteria in the state. The state of Texas, on the other end of the spectrum, we don't do heliports. Call the FAA. I mean, that's literally what they say. Then the municipality, that's the area where you're going to do what we talked about, the land use piece. And there are several different pieces in there that you have to pay attention to. That is usually, as it is today, the hardest nut to crack when doing heliports. And I expect it will be the same for vertiports. So you could get authorization from the FAA, but in the FAA advisory circular for heliports, it specifically tells you you need to contact the state and local municipality, because once you get into the zoning criteria, that is a huge pain.
Does the process work really effective? You identify a parcel,
Mm-hmm.
no municipal approval, no vertical, right?
Correct.
Okay, public or private funding, public off the table.
You need to have that permission from the local municipality. And you bring up a great point, because when I go to you as a municipality and I go to the Planning and Zoning Commission, I'm going to say, hey, I want to put in a heliport in your backyard. The first thing he's going to do is go to the book, open the book up and see, what is a heliport? Do we address it? Is it something that we have a zoning criteria for? And having worked in that space for 25 years, a lot of municipalities don't have the term heliport on the book. Some do, but they don't have any of the conditional use criteria. So we have to make that up as we go. So you can go through the system. So that's one of the things we talk to municipalities, and I've had this discussion with Robert and Nancy several times, is we have to help the municipality understand this better quickly so that they can figure out what the terms they need to look at, what they need to adopt, and what type of conditional use permitting process needs to be put in place. Because if you don't have that, more money, more time, more pain, more challenges.
I have to say, Greg, this is exactly what's happening with drones. Why we keep running drone reports as an issue, right? So, at least with vertiports, we can point to an FAA document that says, here's a vertiport. It's canceled before, now they have to engineering for your vertiport from the system. Can't do that with drones. There is no drone port. There is no recognition of drone port. There's no anything to the FAA. So you start noticing our large areas that they carved out with these areas where drones take off and land multiple times during the day that didn't go through municipal process, weren't zoned for it, because there was nothing that covered it, right? And even on most of the state and municipal side, they talk about referring to the FAA and those guidance. And a lot of times when it comes down to drones, they haven't made that connection to drones or aircraft, so they don't fly the aircraft. So what you end up is you start having these things thrown together without protected airspace, without the other things. Now, when we come in and try to put in a vertiport or heliport or some other facility and start doing the parts that work and looking at how to approach it, or now you have all these things that pop up out of nowhere on your ground truth research of drones doing stuff that weren't there and weren't tracked either, which is why it's really great what's happening with vertiports, but we have to get ahead of the drones.
So what's the business case for allocating capital for, all the VTOLs in the world are great. But land, I understand the practice this morning, because they have roughly 60 miles or so after coming time. But if these things have to land, and they need to be nourished in the sense they need to actually charge infrastructure. So who's going to put this in? And what's the rationale for the allocation of capital to acquire the land, build the facility? It seems simple enough to do, but I think when it gets right down to it, it's very complicated and likely very expensive with it. Most importantly, unclear.
Now, lots of good questions, no really good answers. I would say that in talking to all the different players involved, that's one of those challenges. And in working with Congress, talking to the Senate and the congressman in that space, is like we have to ask them the question, what do you want to call this? What oversight do you want to have? Because right now, if I go to you and say, you want to put in a vertiport, the first question is it public use or is it private use? Because those are the only two categories I have. If I call it public use, I have to allow anybody and everybody to come in there. Student pilots with the right certification, with the right aircraft equipage. At a large airport, we have general aviation on one side, we have commercial. Vertiports aren't going to have that luxury. They're going to be very small. That's one of the reasons we only have 54 public use heliports in the United States. Everything else is private, because if I say it's private, I then have the authority to say, no, you can't land there. It's my heliport. Here are the things I have to do. You have to have this type of aircraft. You have to have this type of insurance. You have to have this type of training program. You have to be Part 135. Oh, and you can't land here with a single engine helicopter. It's got to be twin engine.
It seems like this is one of the reasons that the vertiport in Chicago, which was height like to the hill, in the development stage, they somehow put together funding, capital staff plan, and it worked. Built it, and faces it all. I think there might be a few coming. They waive the fee, buy the fuel, thank you very much, leave. But, you know, it's hardly enough to sustain, you know, an operation from a reasonable business case.
Yeah, and you bring up a great point that when you look at the survivability of heliports, that's again, the business case is the hardest thing to do. In that aspect, they're called a vertiport. They are, in fact, actually a heliport because that's what they're on the regulation as. That's what's signed off on. But in that,
I think they actually use the term not really knowing.
yeah, they said it's the Chicago vertiport, but it's still signed off on a heliport. Same with Dallas Fort Worth. They have a vertiport, but it's actually, but the problem we run into, and this is Dallas, Fort Worth is a good example of this, and also Indianapolis downtown heliport. They're public use, but nobody's there. So if you go in and you go out the gate, there's nobody to let you back in. So it's not really a public use facility as we would expect for business use at an airport. There's always somebody there. So that's one of the challenges we run into is how do you run these? Because in business case, there's been a lot of heliports that have folded because they hung their hat on one thing for making money. So looking at vertiports, the business case for vertiports has got to have multiple revenue streams to keep them alive. Who's going to pay for it? Is it public use? Is it private use? We've talked about, is there a third category we need to talk about? Is it commercial use? Because there are 2,350 medical use heliports in the United States today. Now, when I say medical use, that could be at a hospital. That could be at the backyard of some fire station, law enforcement, state park. There are over 6,000 hospitals in the United States. Out of that 2,350 medical use heliports, we're missing at least 2,000 hospitals. Now, all those are private use, but Part 135 commercial operators are landing and taking off there every day. You as a consumer go to American Airlines, United Airlines, Delta Airlines, and you get a flight. You get to choose what airport, what airline, what seat, what time of day. You want first class, you want cabin. You get all these choices. When you're on a hospital transport, you're probably not conscious. You don't get any choice in anything. And you have no idea whether those aircraft are landing and taking off from facilities that meet any standard whatsoever. That's where we get into this challenge is what's the public acceptance going to demand oversight? Because the FAA has absolutely no authority over private use. You could have the most dangerous heliport known to man, and there's nothing the FAA can do about it. It's only if it's a state and local. Mm-hmm. Recommendation. Yep.
Incorporate it into the design, but it's still very challenging to understand how to make it go. If you look at a fixed base operator at a business airport, they have, to your point, multiple streams of revenue. They rent cars, they sell tons of gas, they lease hangar spaces, $2.50 square foot aircraft. It really adds up. It becomes big money. But there's a predictable use.
Well, and in having this conversation with everybody, one of the things and I'll go back to what Robert said, crawl, walk, run. We're just starting to crawl. And in that crawl phase, I think what we're probably going to see is you're going to see a lot of operations starting at airports, just because it's easier. There's airspace there. They have a bigger footprint. They generally have electricity available. Like I said, most heliports don't have any, and if they do, it's probably only 110 volts if you're lucky. So in that space, I think you'll see business models start there because it's less expensive. Robert had mentioned AIP funding, Airport Improvement Planning funding. One of the questions I'd brought up, haven't gotten an answer to, is when you buy a ticket on an eVTOL, are we going to tax that ticket like we do airplanes? Because that money is accessible for infrastructure improvement. Well, if I'm going to pay a tax as a vertiport, I'd expect to actually get that funding, whether I'm private or public. That's a good question to have. So I think I'll wrap up here real quick is one of the things to pay really, really close attention to, and this is one of the things the Vertical Flight Society, HAI, Gamma, and the associations are, is what is being said in the Federal Aviation Reauthorization Plan, what's being said on Capitol Hill in Congress. And in that space, we want to make sure that people like yourselves have that voice to have those challenging discussions, if not arguments, to make sure that whatever we come up with is feasible and, like you said, meets a business model that's going to be successful. So in that space, I would say pay very close attention to what's going on. I'm the infrastructure advisor to the Vertical Flight Society and work in that space with Helicopter Association International, ASTM, NFPA. All those are working in this space on standards. Now it's, okay, are those standards applicable? Who enforces them? Who teaches those? Who gets to make that decision? Those are a lot of unanswered questions at this time. So with that, I will go ahead and close out, give you a couple extra minutes for lunch. Thank you very much for your attention. Great discussion. We'll carry it on for the rest of the day. Thank you.